So we explore the effect of working in an automatable job on mental health and life satisfaction. We use an Australian panel data set, HILDA, to apply a fixed effects linear regression approach, controlling for individual, time and area level fixed effects. Overall, we found evidence that automatable work has a small detrimental impact on the mental health and life satisfaction of workers within some industries, particularly those with higher levels of job automation risk, such as those in the manufacturing industry. We find no strong trends to suggest that any particular demographic group is disproportionately impacted across industries, and we also find evidence of adaptation to these effects after a one-year tenure on the job, indicating potentially a limited role for firm policy beyond retention over 1 year. So some background and motivation for our research. So new and emerging technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution are changing how people live, work and communicate with one another. So in fact, over the next decade, new technologies are predicted to make up to 47% of jobs in the EU partially automatable and 35% of jobs fully automatable. And similar trends are projected across the UK, Australia, the US and a number of other regions. And so while much of this research has explored the potential impacts of job automation on labour market outcomes during this transition period, there's been quite little research which has examined the impact of this automation on workers' mental health and life satisfaction. Yet with the projected scale of automation, understanding whether labour automation has a detrimental effect on mental health and life satisfaction of workers likely has important implications for public policy. In fact, if we're going to see this scale of automation, and it does have a detrimental effect on people's mental health. So that led to our central research question, which is that, is working in an automatable occupation negatively associated with mental health and life satisfaction? So to answer this question, we looked retrospectively to explore whether working in an automatable occupation has been associated with mental health and life satisfaction during the third industrial revolution, so essentially the 1960s until now. So instead of looking forward-looking, we're looking retrospectively. We used a fixed effects linear regression to relate a person being in automatable work to proxies of their well-being, using 18 waves of the household income and labour dynamics in Australia panel data set, so the HILDA. And we built on the work of Orta and Dawn, defining automatable work as jobs which have high levels of routine task intensity, or RTI, and are therefore most replicable by technologies such as computers and automation. So these are jobs which are high in abstract and routine, routine and manual tasks, and therefore easily codified by technology. So just to demonstrate the trends of what's been happening to automatable work in Australia, which is where we're looking, we can see that over the last sort of 50 years, we've seen a marked decline in what we're calling routine task-intense occupations. So the proportion of manual and routine tasks, as you can see, has really been declining as a proportion of the tasks that are being performed by human labour across the Australian workforce. And at the same time, we see an increase in the number of abstract tasks that are being completed. So that's just demonstrating the change that we've seen. And so our question is essentially, have we seen an impact on mental health and life satisfaction that corresponds with this change? So our hypotheses looked at, firstly, we hypothesized firstly that job automation risk is negatively associated with mental health and subjective well-being. And secondly, that this was essentially stronger for those who are at more risk of job automation, so those who are in industries which have seen higher levels of automation over the past couple of decades. So the reason why we hypothesized this was based on a range of the existing literature in related fields. But the primary mechanism that the literature proposes is essentially that job precarity is the primary channel through which occupational automation risk influences mental health and well-being. So it's essentially argued that because job automation risk increases your job insecurity, it follows that working in an automatable occupation could have a detrimental effect on the mental health and life satisfaction by inducing job insecurity. So essentially, if you're in an automatable occupation and you're seeing that people around you are losing their jobs, perhaps that's increasing your job insecurity and therefore detracting your mental health. Others suggest that routine and repetitive work itself has been linked with negative impacts on mental health and life satisfaction due to the impact of boredom or potentially the physical labour which is often associated with manual tasks. So that also suggests that there might be a negative association. In contrast, some of the characteristics of automatable occupations may have a positive association with mental health and life satisfaction if they're associated with things like better work-life balance and lower levels of stress. So that also went the other way. So we wanted to look at both. So I'm just going to skip forward actually and talk about our methods. So we used 18 waves of the Hilda longitudinal survey data, which initially consisted of about 19,000 participants. The sample was restricted to those whose labour force status was employed across all waves, because we wanted to look at the impact of working in an automatable occupation as opposed to potentially losing your job and that having an impact on your mental health. We estimated our model across our full sample and also disaggregated by age, gender, and level of education to identify heterogeneous effects across those different demographic groups. And by nature, the fixed effects model captures the effects of moving between occupational automatability classifications. So we disaggregated by the direction of movement, either into or out of an automatable occupation. So essentially, if you move from an automatable occupation into a non-automatable occupation, does that improve your mental health and vice versa? So to talk about the model in a little more detail, so our independent variable was occupational automatability. So we used a binary classification of job automatability based on Order and Dawn's classification, and they classify as an occupation as automatable, where it has been found to be in the top third of routine task intense occupations. So essentially, if yours are in the top third, you were classified as automatable, and not if you sat in the bottom 2/3. And then our dependent variables were life satisfaction, and we also looked at mental health using the available data in the Hilda panel dataset. So we put that into our broader model, in which we also controlled for individual fixed effects, time fixed effects for each wave, and then area level fixed effects at sub groups in Australia, sub areas, sorry. And then our standard areas were two-way clustered by occupation and industry. We ran a number of robustness specifications, a whole range, so that was including our model, which excluded individual fixed effects. We also used a continuous rather than binary occupational automatability variable. We used an unbalanced data set. We included area by time fixed effects. We also lagged our outcome variable to identify any potential legacy effects. We included additional control variables, so we tried 3 different groups of additional control variables, the first being income, marital status, race, so socioeconomic disadvantage and age and age squared, and hours worked, income, hours worked, and tenure and role. So we ran a large number of robustness specifications. So what did we find? We found evidence that automated work has a small detrimental impact on the mental health and life satisfaction of workers within some industries, particularly those with higher levels of automation, including manufacturing, construction, and transport. We interestingly found a notable exception in the services industry, and considering that the services industry is the only industry which has not seen declining employment opportunities for lower skilled workers. This finding supports the hypothesis that the negative effects of automatable work on mental health and life satisfaction are driven by job precarity. So essentially in the services industry, we've seen less decline because those routine tasks are harder to be replaced by automatable, by computers, etc., due to the nature of services. So while statistically significant, the effects on mental health are relatively small in magnitude, typically reducing mental health and well-being by less than 0.2 standard deviations. And I'll just show what that looks like in our effects. So this is our effects on mental health. So on the left-hand column, we see our pooled effects. We don't see any effects across our full workforce, but when we start to look by industry, you can start to see that where people are moving to non-automatable occupations, their mental health is improving, with the exception of the services sector there. We see similar effects, but less strong for moving to an automatable occupation, which is interesting as well. This is the effects on life satisfaction. So we see similar sorts of effects, but they do diminish when you look at life satisfaction as opposed to mental health. So looking at the effects of our results on heterogeneous associations by age, gender, and education level, we saw more significant effects among women in construction industry and the youngest workers. However, we find no strong trends to suggest that any demographic group is sort of disproportionately impacted across industries. So while we did see some effects within subgroups, there was no strong indications that this was sort of systematic. And our findings were robust across the range of additional model specifications, with the exception of the lagged model. And this indicates that after moving into or out of an automatable occupation, individuals adapt their new automatability risk to 1 year on the job. So they essentially adapt to their new environment of an automatable or non-automatable job, suggesting that potentially there's not as much of a role for firms, for example, than trying to keep people beyond that 1 year retention. So this is just a quick summary of some of the many, many numbers that we found. I won't go through them all out of kindness. And then our limitations and further research, and then I'll throw to questions. So our primary limitations, I think, is particularly that we looked at those who remained in employment. So our research was interested in the effects of automation on those who remain in work rather than the effect of unemployment. So we restricted our panel, as I mentioned, to just those who remained employed. This does, however, mean that we didn't see the impact on a lot of people who may have left the labour force because they worked in an automatable occupation, so we couldn't track that effect. So I think that an extension that I would like to look into, I think that would be interesting, would be to look at the impact using a different methodology. And then further research, replication across geographic regions, so seeing if these findings hold, and then impact of policy interventions on well-being. So I think it would be really interesting, as so much of the work is currently looking at the impact in the labour market and trying to mitigate the effects of automation on people in the labour force. When you're trying to create that and get people to upskill and reskill, for example, does that also have a positive impact on their mental health, even if they're staying in that automatable occupation? So to me, that would be an interesting opportunity for extension. I will leave it there, and I'll see if there's any questions.
Hi. Sure. Great paper. So I was wondering, I understand why you look at people who move in and out of a job which is automatable, but since you're looking at this long period of time, could you look at whether some jobs are becoming automatable? So new softwares, technology, and so this would be completely exogenous, like a person suddenly finds herself in an automatable job, and what is the impact on her?
Yeah, so I think that was part of the appeal to us of using the methodology we did around how to quantify what an automatable job was, because it's not, it was basically the proportion of how routine and manual the occupation you are, rather than than sort of any other way of making it, yes, it's automatable right now. That being said, I think the research suggests that if we were looking into the future and projecting out the impact, you would need to increase that proportion of things that are automatable relative to the baseline we used because of the fact that so much more is about to be able to be codified and automatable. So what constitutes an automatable job in 1960 is very different from what will in 2022 and what is going to be in 2062.
Thank you. The data out of the Foundation for Young Australians indicates that the current generation under 25 is the most stressed that there's ever been, and about 25% of all jobs being created at the moment are gig jobs.
Gig jobs.
Gig jobs. So to what extent of what you're seeing is, as opposed to automation, is the fact that zero-hour contracts are really becoming the norm in that segment of the population, and therefore that's driving the impact on well-being?
So I think that's a great question. I think that is one area that I would love to explore further. Because we did especially look at those people who remained employed, I think we would have lost out on some of those people because even if they remained in the workforce, it would not be in the same, it wouldn't be captured by our data. So I would say that like people becoming unemployed, you also would see a lot of effects on people who are underemployed, especially in those kinds of age groups. So I think this is the first foray into this sort of area, especially using panel data. It would be great to see whether you could start to capture those effects on some of those people who get lost in some of this.
Job precarity mechanism, and I think, Andrew, you make a very good point about the gig worker piece. I ask because I'm more interested in the moderating effect of age. As you were talking, I was expecting the results to be the opposite. Your results said that younger people were more impacted than older people, and perhaps I'm generalising, but perhaps the generation above me might have had a job for life, whereas generation below me no longer view a career as a job for life, but rather a journey and continuous education and the need to adapt. So I would have hypothesized, as you were talking, that perhaps the older generation, seeing the risk of becoming obsolete, might be more impacted. And so that's where I think, Andrew, your point might go some way to answering why the moderating impact seemed higher for younger people. But have I understood the moderating impact by age correctly?
I think so. So we did see impacts across different, so there was younger groups that were particularly affected within some industries. I think it was retail actually, but we saw in other industries, things like manufacturing, construction, you did see the impact predominantly driven by those workers over 40. Noting as well that when you're starting to get down to the level of within industry, within age group, the sample size was getting smaller, which is where we were sort of reluctant to draw any strong trends. Yeah.
I had a question around how much this is being driven by the perception of job insecurity versus feeling valued. Because if you look at employee data in Australia, actually, for industries like mining that have gone through major digitization, you actually see job satisfaction, engagement scores going up rather than down. And so if it's done in a way that makes employees feel more valued and takes away some of their routine stuff, I just wondered the degree to which you've put in there that it's actually about job insecurity versus potentially other factors.
Yeah, I absolutely would think about other factors. To me, I think some of this suggests that it's potentially the salience of other people around you losing their job that's driving the negative effects. So if you're in the manufacturing industry, we've seen over the last 50 years huge losses in some of those industries in Australia. So if you're seeing that people in your workforce are around you, that's very salient that your job is becoming insecure. But if you compare that that to another industry, and in fact in some demographic groups, we saw it was interesting to compare to previous research that said that some groups were just as at risk as others, but perhaps they weren't aware or it wasn't as salient. So I think that's a really interesting question of which is it driven by? Is it driven by the salience of it, or is it driven, and for those who remain in the industry, even if other people are losing their jobs, are you then potentially, is your employment more meaningful, or do you take on more responsibility? Definitely areas for further research, I think.
Any other questions? Let's go a little bit in the back and then come in the front.
Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I was just wondering how you actually measure this automatability index, because my concern is that you're not really measuring automatability, but just job quality.
So automatability was a measure of, so essentially how routine task intensive is your occupation. So essentially that was a breakdown as to the proportions of your occupation, which would be abstract, manual, or routine. So it sort of defined it. If you had a high proportion of routine and manual jobs that are then more easily replicable by technology, that was how we defined high automatability, but that was where we said in the potential mechanisms, I don't think we've answered that question of, is it that potential negative effects are driven by potentially, is it that those jobs are inherently lower quality, and also vice versa? Could those jobs be higher quality because maybe there's other things associated with those jobs? We just can't tell from this yet, but I think the fact that we didn't see effects in the services industry, but we did in manufacturing and construction, suggests that actually maybe it is being driven by job precarity, because the services industry was the only industry that hasn't seen that same decline in occupation opportunities. In fact, it's the only industry in which you've seen growth in job opportunities relative to those other industries which have similarly highly automatable jobs, but have seen decline. So I think this starts to suggest, I don't think it's conclusive, but it starts to suggest that it is the job precarity rather than the inherent nature of the job.
So we have just one more question. The hands go down when I say it. Okay, if we have the mic there, just Mark, go ahead.
Thanks. It's really short. So really as a follow-up to what you just finished on there, there's a question in Hilda that's something like your subjective assessment of how likely you are to lose your job in the next year. Did you use that at all? And I think there's also a question on satisfaction with job security.
I think we did look at those. I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. It was a while ago since I've gotten to that level. I remember we captured that. I think there was an issue with the sample size because it might have been taken in only every fourth wave. So I don't think we were able to use that in the same way we were able to use the rest of the data. Excellent.
Okay. Do we have time for more? No. Okay. One last.
Okay.